Jezebel writes Elijah. Elijah runs from Jezebel. Elijah complains to the Lord. The Lord comforts Elijah with a revelation and an exhortation. Silas and Timothy join Paul in planting the church in Corinth, and Apollos is discipled by Priscilla and Aquila. Today on 3 in 1, as we consider 1 Kings chapters 19 through 20 and Acts chapter 18.
Well, I'm not sure if you noticed, but we had a special guest on today's episode of 3 in 1, my son Silas. He came up with the idea of reading the intro, and I think it's rather appropriate since his name was mentioned in today's reading. And also, I'm not getting any younger, with this being my 40th birthday, and also, Silas is learning to share the load, and that's a really good thing. Sure am blessed by that kid, as I am by all the little kiddos that I've heard read the Word and listen to 3 in 1 on a regular basis, including my niece, Maddie. Well done, little ones. You are making an investment in eternity, especially at such an early age. Really, well done. Well, what was our Old Testament reading today? 1 Kings chapters 19 and 20. You are probably used to it by now as we approach the end of a book. If the chapters are not evenly divisible by 3, we have to adjust our reading just a bit. So 2 chapters today and 2 chapters tomorrow, as tomorrow we end the book of 1 Kings. Maybe the next time around we'll do things differently, overlapping the end with the beginning of the next book. But today we have chapters 19 and 20, where I would like to draw your attention to this interaction between Jezebel and Elijah, which precipitates an interaction between Elijah and the Lord. We said yesterday that Elijah was a man just like us. Well, we didn't say that, James did. In James chapter 5, verses 17 and 18, it says, Elijah was a person just like us, and he prayed earnestly for it not to rain. And rain never came to the land for 3 years and 6 months. Then he prayed again, and the skies poured out rain, and the ground produced its crops. Yesterday we related his great faith and God's great ability to answer faith-filled prayer, whether that prayer is from a prophet or from a little child like my son Silas or my daughter Josephine or my niece Maddie. On vacation here, we spent Sunday morning talking about all of this, swapping stories about answered prayer with our kids and with our cousins, whether that prayer was for a purple bike or a lost Nerf ball or for God to stop the rain. God heard them all, and he answered them all, just like he heard and answered the prayers of the prophet Elijah. So yes, Elijah was a man just like us. He had times of great faith and great faith-filled prayers, but he also, just like us, had lapses of faith, walking in fear rather than walking in faith, like we read today, as Elijah received a message from Ahab's wife, Jezebel, where she said, "May the gods do the same to me, and even more, if tomorrow by this time I have not made you like one of the prophets that you had killed." Elijah was terrified, so he got up and ran for his life to Beersheba, which is part of Judah, and he left his servant there and ran for a day's journey deep into the wilderness, and he found a juniper tree, sat down under it, and prayed that he could die. He asked God, "Enough, Lord, take my life, because I'm not better than my ancestors." Fearful, terrified really, running away, discouraged, depressed. Is this Elijah? Yes, Elijah was a man just like us. I mean, just yesterday he fought by faith 450 false prophets in an incredible all-or-nothing contest in front of an entire nation in an effort to reach the hearts of the entire nation. And then he gets a little letter from one woman, and Elijah is terrified, and he runs away, and he's so discouraged that he asks God to end his life? Yes. Why? Because Elijah was a man, just like me. Man, I remember vividly in the early years of pastoring, we had some people that hated us severely, and they wanted to end our ministry, and they attacked us viciously for a really long time. And as it was happening, I resolved to never get in the ring, to never defend myself, to never fight back. I wanted the Lord to be my defender. So I just stayed the course, and I continued to do what God had called me to do in the building up of believers. We were going through Nehemiah at the time, And from the word, like a flashing neon sign, all I kept seeing, all I kept hearing was, never stop building. Never stop building yourself up in this most holy faith. Never stop building up your brothers and sisters in this most holy faith. And as for the battle belongs to the Lord. So that's what I did, endeavoring to outlast my enemies in love. Now, with all that being said, I had some days exactly like what we read today. Days where I was not filled with faith. Days where I was filled with fear. Days where I was curled up in a ball in the corner of my office begging God to win this battle because my enemies were too strong for me. So I am encouraged, not only by the fact that Elijah was a man just like me, but I am also encouraged by how God got me through that time, just like he got Elijah through that time of terror, just like he will walk you through your time. Even if it is a valley as dark as death's shadow, he will never leave you. He will never forsake you. He will lead you all the way through, caring for you tenderly along the way, calling you to continue to do what God has given you to do. Just like we read with today, sorry, I'm a little distracted. I just had this ginormous spider on my arm as I was reading through what we're saying today, that I flicked it off. And I was just thinking how God calls us to shake those things off. Remember when Paul the Apostle was there after that shipwreck and he was on the island of Malta and he goes to make that fire, and as he's making the fire, the viper jumps out of the fire and latches onto his hand and he shakes it off? I love that. I mean, God had taken him through such difficult times that he looks at this viper, this venomous viper attached to his hand with the fangs sinking deep, and he just shakes it off. And I can imagine him thinking, dude, you don't know what God's got me through already. You're nothing. And he just shakes it off. I love that. God gets us through dark times. God allows us to flick off huge spiders. God continues to call us to do what he's called us to do, no matter what. And he did this with Elijah. He did this with Elijah after Elijah poured out his heart, unedited to God, including his terror and despair and depression. God didn't fire him. God cared for him. He fed him. He led him. He spoke to him in a still small voice. And he called him to continue, saying, I still have stuff for you to do, Elijah, so you can't quit. And I love that. I love that God didn't fire him. He lets him vent. He even drew it all out of him by saying to him again and again, what are you doing here, Elijah? And then after Elijah poured out his heart, God poured out his heart to Elijah. And he didn't acknowledge Elijah's fear as some sort of reason to quit. He fueled Elijah's faith by continuing to call him into the fight of faith. Man, there was times where I thought I was fired for sure. Just end my life now, God. I'm no better than anyone else. I'm giving in to fear. I'm a horrible pastor. How could you call me to preach? And yet God continued to call me into the ministry, just like he continued to call Elijah into the ministry. Elijah thought he was fired for sure. I mean, he said to God, just end my life. I ran away from one little letter from one woman, terrified. I'm no better than anyone else. How could you call me into the ministry? How could you call me to be a prophet? And it was as if God was saying to Elijah, okay, now that you've got all that out, for the third time, I've got some work for you to do. I've got some work that needs to be done, and I want you to do it. I love that. It's like a father raising a son. Full of grace, yes, but full of truth. Kind of like Jesus with Peter. After Peter's lapse of faith because of fear, Jesus asked him a few times, Simon, do you love me? Just like God asked Elijah a few times, what are you doing here, Elijah? And then Jesus, he continued to call Simon Peter into the ministry, saying, feed my lambs, tend my sheep, feed my sheep, just like God continued to call Elijah into the ministry. So, don't be afraid to tell God that you're afraid. Don't be afraid to tell God that you're terrified. Don't be afraid to tell God that your enemies are too strong for you. He will not fire you for your lack of faith. He will feed you and care for you and listen to you, and then he will continue to call you into the ministry. Because that's just how good our God really is. Well, there's so much more that happened in our Old Testament reading, but for the sake of time, we have to move on now to our New Testament reading. And yes, it pains me to move on and not talk about the amazing way that God spoke to Elijah. But it would pain me even more to know that you were just listening to this podcast without actually reading the Word. Please go back and crack that book. Make the time. Read those 2 chapters. Spend some time thinking through what God is saying to you. It is an eternal investment. It's a worthy work. It's an excellent difficulty working through the entirety of God's great word. Okay, on to Acts chapter 18, where we saw Silas and Timothy join the Apostle Paul in planting the church in Corinth. And we saw Apollos discipled by Priscilla and Aquila. Corinth was an intense place, saturated with sin, saturated with sinners. And yet Paul had a powerful and fruitful ministry there, preaching the simple gospel, saying to the Corinthians in his first letter to them, I, brethren, when I came to you, I didn't come with excellence of speech or with wisdom declaring to you the testimony of God, for I determined not to know anything among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. I was with you in weakness, in fear, and in much trembling. Hey, he sounds like Elijah. He sounds like me. It continues to say, my speech and my preaching were not with persuasive words of human wisdom, but in demonstration of the Spirit and of power, that your faith should not be in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God. I love that. Paul was willing to be a broken vessel so that God would get all the glory. God repeatedly loves to use the broken, the foolish, the forgotten, with a demonstration of the Spirit and of power, so that faith would not be in the wisdom of men, but rather in the power of God. So, that was the heartbeat of Paul's ministry in Corinth as the church was being planted. And as the church was being planted, Silas and Timothy joined him to help him in discipling these new believers. Now, as we read today, even the Apostle Paul was afraid at times as he encountered opposition as well. How do I know this? Because God said to him, as we read today, do not be afraid, but speak, and do not keep silent, for I am with you, and no one will attack you to hurt you, for I have many people in this city. See, God would not have said, do not be afraid, unless Paul was afraid. So even the Apostle Paul was a man just like us. And God continued to call him into the ministry, even after he was afraid, saying, do not be afraid, but speak, and do not keep silent, for I am with you. Oh man, isn't that all we need to hear? I am with you. And it puts wind in our sails to where we say, you got it, God, here we go. And so Paul preached. He preached for 1.5 years there in Corinth as he planted the church and taught them the Word of God. Now, before we go, we also read of a man today named Apollos. Apollos was in Ephesus, and he was preaching powerfully. He was preaching accurately, but there was something missing. There was a crack in his armor, and so Priscilla and Aquila came alongside of Apollos to minister to him and to strengthen him. And oh, how thankful I am for the Aquilas and Priscillas in my life. There was this couple during that dark time that I mentioned at the beginning that came alongside of me and sustained me by speaking the truth to me lovingly during that time. And I want to tell you seriously, apart from their care sent by God, I don't know that I would have survived that time. And yet what they did was just so simple. They said to me, like Jesus, we won't leave you. We will walk through this with you. We're in your corner. You're not alone. And remember, The battle, which will be over before you know it, belongs to the Lord. See, guys, we have such an opportunity to do the same thing in someone else's life. When they're so scared they can't see straight, we can come alongside of them and we can listen to them and we can reassure them that although I may not be able to end what you're going through, you do not have to go through it alone. I will be with you, I will not leave you, and I will remind you of God's great love for you all the way through. All the way through. You have a friend in Jesus, and you have a friend in me.